Well, hello, my name is Mike McDonald. I am a former professor of business, specifically focusing on leadership and organizational behavior and leadership theory. I'm also certified in Bowen Systems Theory and also currently work in a large Fortune 500 company where I practice these leadership theories that I'm about to review today. So there are many people in the world who are familiar with systems theory, taken from Murray Bowen, and there are some publications talking about applying systems theory in business, but very few. This is still an emerging and growing area. And so today we're going to talk about Murray Bowen's theory of systems theory, which has been taken to be applied to leadership. And so we will focus today on how you can grow your business, how you can be successful as a leader in your business by growing the people around you, by ironically first focusing on growing yourself. And so many of you are already familiar with this. It's probably the first thing you see when you open your email in the morning, when you come into your office, or maybe you see this every day as you watch the news before you go to work. Um, but many experts today are recognizing and speaking out loud to the fact that our economy, our businesses, our healthcare systems, our governments, we are all in the midst of major crises. And these are through many international, global, interconnected factors like supply and demand, rising prices, interest rates, inflation, multiple economic pressures, and internal pressure in our places of work for business growth and good financial economics. Also, when we stop and reflect on our own lives or those around us, we see that many of us in business spend as much time with our workplace family as we do with our family at home. And that's probably not a good thing. That's probably not what we wanted to do when we first began our careers. And so, this is a time to pause and reflect on how our leadership philosophy about work in our workplace can actually positively shape and mold the lives of the people that we hire, that we manage, that we work for, that we work with, and of course, the customers that we serve in business today. And so, what I would advocate for, and what many who practice Bowen theory would advocate for, is a new approach. When we look at leadership seminars today, when we look at leadership books today, they're focused more on more data, more information. They're focused more on technique. They're focused more on building things like charisma. And so these are linear processes. These are processes where we are trying to fix and change others. What Bowen Systems does is it brings a new approach. This is more of a systemic approach, and we'll talk more about that, what that means. And it's more about improving oneself. If the plane is about to go into the water, you first put on your own oxygen mask before attempting to put on the oxygen mask of those around you. And so that is what we're doing here. So, in this approach, we refer to good leaders as high functioning or differentiated or non anxious leaders. And these are leaders where within their companies and their organizations, by following systems theory, they can actually become the best catalyst for growing their business by growing their employees. And so, this is a new way of looking at business where we can actually create change by first being the change that we want to expect in others. So, what is systems theory? At the onset, systems theory was created by a psychiatrist and researcher. His name was Dr. Murray Bowen. He lived, or rather, was born in the early 1900s, and his theory is supported today by a really large body of evidence, both in psychology and in business. We see it in publications such as Harvard Business School, and it's taught in many leading business schools today. In fact, this is something I taught at the university level as well. Just as a backgrounder, Bowen was an Army physician during the Second World War, and he really became interested on the effects of stress on soldiers and how was it that when some people led, they were less significantly impacted by trauma and were able to move on, while there were others who, at the slightest amount of trauma or stress, froze and were unable to move forward. So he then noticed in his research these predictable patterns of how we as people manage anxiety in the groups that we worked with. And he realized that there is a multitude of factors coming at us from multiple different directions that influence the way that we show up and operate under high degrees of stress. And so he calls this a systems approach. And so today we see business leaders applying this approach by first seeking to understand how the people around them and how they themselves are responding under stressful business circumstances. And so Bowen became frustrated with psychology, as many people are today. Not that it is not good, but psychology largely focuses on diagnosing and focusing on others, almost in a finger pointing way, where it can become largely unhelpful in some circumstances. And so Bowen believed that over focusing on diagnosing other people and ignoring the systemic challenges around you is bad. And it certainly is bad for business. We see that happening a lot in toxic business cultures today. And so instead, systems theory encourages us as leaders to focus on our own leadership presence. And it encourages us to focus on how our own behaviors can impact those in the workplace around us. And so there's data that supports, published data that supports that this systemic approach to business can indeed positively impact not only a leader's impact, but also the behavior of the entire workplace. It's amazing how just the change of one leader within the entire large system can have a huge ripple effect across the entirety of the business. And so for a minute, let's talk about words and terminology, because while many of the terms were originally introduced in Bowen theory, for the medical field, we'll have to adapt them so that they can be applied into the business arena, which is what we're doing today. And so usually when we talk about anxiety in society, we talk about the traditional definition, right? The emotion that's surrounding the highly unpleasant state that a person is feeling with their own inner turmoil, right? So maybe you get called in last minute to do a presentation to the CEO or to the board or to the president of your company. Maybe your business is not performing and you need to review numbers, or maybe you didn't hit budget, right? That's normal everyday anxiety. So in systems theory for business, yes, anxiety does include that, but it's actually broader. So when we talk about anxiety today, anxiety is really any feeling that is disrupting the business system. Whereas you can see in the image to your left, anything that causes a ripple in the system. And so this could simply be the addition or removal of a member from your team. It could be concern or worry about you or your team about a major layoff. It could be simply workplace conflict, stress over budgets, or worry about sales performance. But anything that causes the water to ripple is what we're going to term as anxiety throughout the course of this presentation. Family is another term we'll be adopting. Now, of course, in systems theory, originally by Murray Bowen, it meant a group of one or more parents with children living together as one family unit. And systems theory for business, family really means a workplace group. It can be C or D-suite leadership team. It can be a group of colleagues. It can be a sales team, a marketing team. But any group of individuals that is placed together, that comes together frequently on a regular basis for a joint area of focus or for a similar purpose. That is the workplace family. Now, something that we carry with us everywhere that we go, whether we want to or not, is what we call family of origin. So family of origin is simply the place you grew up. It's the emotional unit where you are raised, and that doesn't necessarily have to be biological. If you spent most of your time growing up with your grandparents, that would be your family of origin. And then the last term would be your nuclear family, right? Your nuclear family is the people that you see after work, right? This is the family group that's formed after you leave your family of origin, and these are the people that you get up and work for every single day. So just a quick 10,000 look view at the 8 interlocking concepts of Bowen theory. And again, many of these will be renamed so that we can adapt them for the business environment. But they are here on your left: the nuclear family emotional system. Second, the concept of differentiation of self. Third is the concept of triangles. Fourth is distancing and cutoff. Fifth is what they call the family projection process. Sixth is what is referred to as the multi-generational transmission process. Seventh is sibling position, and eighth is societal emotional process. And as you can see by the image here, none of them work independently, all of them work together, and all of them work concurrently to influence one another, us and those that we work with. And so as you can see in this image here, by all the arrows pointing in multiple direction, by the change, this is the workplace family emotional system. As I mentioned earlier, psychology focuses on the individual, but in systems theory, the focus is on the entire system. And if you are a good leader, or what we call a high level or differentiated leader, you maintain this mindset at all times. You recognize that the busyness of work, that the pressures of work is a systemic level event. It is not something that we see in just one individual. Bad behavior in individuals, they are just symptoms and telltale signs of what is going on within the larger system. And so what that means is whatever affects one person in the business system is going to affect all people in the business system. If there's a major disagreement over philosophy of business between the CEO and CFO, I promise you at some point in time, that anxiety will eventually, in some way, shape, or form, trickle down to your frontline customer-facing people. And so as we can see here, anxiety, like a virus or a disease with no cure, moves very easily from person to person across the group. And so Murray Bowen discovered that there are 4 very predictable patterns or postures and ways that we respond to stress. And all of us do this subconsciously because we're human. And because the workplace is comprised of humans, these are the postures that we will see at work. We're going to deep dive them in a little bit more detail here in a minute, but just kind of a quick top line review of these 4 postures when we are under stress. The first one is triangling others. Triangling, as I'm sure you can imagine, occurs when one person in the workplace becomes frustrated with another person, and so they pull in another third person in order to manage their anxiety. And so this happens in the workplace in the form of complaining, of gossip, of insinuating, and in spreading rumors. Again, this is just the way that it is. We can't necessarily stop them like gravity triangles just are. They're simply a part of the business system. And so all we can do is be aware of them and as leaders learn to manage our way through them. However, once we do become aware of a workplace triangle, we can make triangles and influence them to where they can be productive as opposed to unproductive. Next, we have the most common form of workplace conflict, and that is conflict. That is disagreement. That is arguing. That is when one person will not submit to the opinion of the other and vice versa. And so, as leaders, you can recognize conflict in the workplace not only through body language, but through phrases and terms. If the person you are speaking to is using things that are absolute in their language, like you never or you always, this is a signal to you that they are feeling conflict with you. Additionally, you will see people project the blame of their own failures or the blame of their own frustration onto another person, holding them responsible. So projection is another form of workplace conflict. And of course, this is bad for business because what happens is as people, we lose shift from our customers and our company mission, and instead we become focused on those around us, and that is not good for anyone. Now, over time, when people get tired of conflict, and they just don't want any more of it. And I'm sure many of us have had days like this. Then distance is the second pattern, or rather the third pattern that begins to take over. This is when people literally, physically, or emotionally distance themselves from one another. And unfortunately, they begin to believe that this has solved the problem when in reality, over time, they begin to learn that they really have not solved anything. They've only changed their posture. In fact, distance has become so common in the American workplace today that it's really become very difficult for leaders to see it as a workplace problem. Most leaders are just happy there's not a problem, and so they're okay with distance. But really, distance is having a negative impact on your team culture, on your mission as a company, and on your customers who need your services and products. And then, of course, the last one we see is what they call over and under functioning in the workplace. So we see this really with a lot of type A type people, maybe firstborn people. They're really go getters. They're very type A and they become very dominant in the workplace. And as some people decide to become more dominant, we have others, due to their own family history, where they become more submissive and they adapt and they surrender decision making. And so the dominant person or the overfunctioner is gaining a sense of self or confidence, but it's coming at a cost. It's coming at the expense of other, more submissive, underfunctioning employees. And when that happens, this underfunctioning employee loses their sense of self or their sense of confidence. And over time, as this pattern repeats itself, they lose their ability to function and to make good decisions on their own. And so, again, this ends up taking away from customer business, from customer focus, and accomplishing the company mission because not all of your employees are being maximized to their greatest potential. Now, the unfortunate thing for the business marketplace is that business leaders have a very bad habit of mistakenly rewarding over-functioning behaviors, not realizing that over-functioners are taking away from the economic and productivity impact of those that they're forcing to underfunction. The next concept, now that we've kind of talked about the emotional system itself and the four patterns, the next concept is what they call the differentiation of self or self differentiation. You'll hear me refer to it throughout this presentation as a high level leader. So, self differentiation is the leader's capacity to remain true to the deepest principles. And this will be a combination of principles and values from their own belief systems, but also from maybe the mission or value statement or credo of the organization that they work for. And so, self differentiation occurs when the leader chooses, under high times of intensity and pressure, to be thoughtful instead of being emotionally reactive, while also at the same time becoming connected to their team. It's easy to become thoughtful and not emotionally reactive while distancing from our team, but it's very challenging to become thoughtful and not reactive while still remaining connected with our team. And so that's the goal, is to do both. Additionally, self differentiation is the capacity for the individual to really separate their intellectual system from their emotional system. And it's not that we don't value emotions, emotions are good, and it's part of our programming. But really, when we're in an anxious situation, we want to be able, as high level leaders, to hit the pause button, to process that initial emotional feeling or that instinct, and to find a way to put productive words, behaviors, and actions behind it, guided by our intellectual system. And it's also important for us as leaders to know that our own level of self differentiation is largely determined by leadership language that we learn early in life, usually through the leadership of our parents and our grandparents and our own families of origin. And this is something that we all bring into the workplace with us each and every day. Now, a low level leader, or someone that Bowen would call undifferentiated, is experienced, honestly, probably by all of us at our worst times of stress, or when we were new to our roles, or maybe younger in our days. And so this leader really does not have a choice between their emotional or an intellectual functioning. They have a choice, they're just not really aware of it. And so anytime a feeling happens, they act automatically out of it. And they really just, there's no filter. Whatever comes into their mind comes out of their mouth. And this leader is unable to pause, unable to stop, unable to think and really process and then verbalize what is good for their people and what is good for the business. And really, you can identify these leaders because they're very symptomatic in all areas of their life. And so you'll hear them talk about a lot how they have poor relationships throughout all areas of their life. They're usually highly absent or tardy to work, or they leave early, or their workday is often interrupted a lot by drama. And so, this is a good indicator to you that you're dealing with a low level leader, and this might be someone who needs some more specific coaching and training to become a more differentiated leader and to develop their emotional intelligence. And of course, this type of leader, again, we've all been there before, but this type of leader becomes more concerned about approval and praise from leadership as opposed to being concerned about their team or their responsibilities or their customers. At the same time, if they get even a healthy dose of criticism from leadership, they will become utterly destroyed and completely incapacitated to do their job for a while because they're so highly dependent upon approval and praise. Whereas a differentiated leader takes approval and praise with a grain of salt, even constructive criticism with a grain of salt, and they continue to move along in their mission. And so the high level leader is less dependent on others for gaining their confidence. Their confidence comes from their value system from within. They have fewer relationship problems across the workplace system. Their decision making, you can see, is based more off of facts than feelings. And you can see that they're able to stop and pause and separate thinking from emotions and to make good decisions. You'll actually see this in the workplace when you're working with them. There'll be a critical or stressful situation, and maybe you're asking them or you see someone else ask them for guidance and direction, and they'll tell you, let's hang on, let's wait a second, let's think about this, let's gather some more facts, and then we'll move forward with the decision later. If you work with a leader who does this, then you're really in a good place because they're choosing to think out of a thoughtful process as opposed to acting out of emotion. The third concept of Bowen systems is called workplace triangles. In fact, you're going to hear the word triangle a lot. The word triangle really comes up repeatedly in five of the 8 aspects of systems theory. Most people, when they learn this theory, they really want to focus on self-differentiation and really just focus on the one area. But I'll be honest with you, if you want to grow as a leader, the first concept you should really learn to understand is what a workplace triangle is and how you can identify it. Because once you do that, you automatically, as a byproduct, become more differentiated in yourself. And so, by nature, because we're humans, two-person systems are stable until business pressures arise. And so, they stabilize that pressure by bringing in a third person. And so, workplace triangles are really the basic building block of any anxious workplace system. Also, we can not only tie in a third person, sometimes under pressure, two people will actually bring in a non-human subject or item, such as the new corporate policy, or the lack of having a budget to do your job, or the reasons why you're not meeting your sales performance. And so we can bring in inanimate objects when triangling with our colleagues. As mentioned earlier, triangles aren't necessarily good or bad, right? Like gravity, they just are. But good leaders learn how to identify them and how to lead through them by staying calm and by observing. And so, how do we lead through triangles? Well, you get yourself into a calm observer position. This often requires pausing, maybe going outside to, quote, take a call, and walking, breathing, reminding yourselves of your goals and your principles and your value systems, um, leveraging all of the vacation and PTO time that you have, really seeking to build margin in your workday because when you do that, you can become a continual calm observer of the system. And when you are a calm, observant leader, you can then begin to think more objectively. And when these stressful triangles present themselves, you can then begin to respond as opposed to react. And then once you are triangled, high level leaders provide really neutral statements, but also statements that are encouraging, saying things such as, I know the two of you can solve this. And so high level leaders move forward again in these triangles, and instead of making statements, they remain curious and ask questions such as, how did you come to that conclusion, or say more about that. You're basically assisting and helping them to guide themselves through the situation as opposed to having to know all the answers. And so self-differentiated leaders don't attempt to know all the answers. That would be a low-level leader. Self-differentiated leaders help others to find answers themselves. Distancing and cutoff, again, as we mentioned earlier, happens very frequently in the workplace. This is the fourth concept of Bowen systems. This happens again as a byproduct of when workplace relationships become overly intense and people just become fatigued from an extended period of conflict. Cutoff is the extreme form of distancing. You'll see this in the workplace in the forms of quiet quitting. You'll see it where the company decides to cut off from the employee and terminate them as opposed to finding a solution. Maybe you'll find the employee changing departments or the employee leaving themselves. These would be forms of cutoff. Cutoff in the workplace can happen very slowly and build up over time, or it can happen very suddenly with no one knowing where it came from. Either way, the team and the company suffers. Cutoff, again, as it's the most extreme form of distance, can also be mutual. And usually in these situations, it is when HR is involved. And of course, if they depart on their own, that would be a unilateral decision. But these are the highest times of anxiety, and these are the times where high-level leaders are needed the most. Now, the fifth concept is what they call the projection process, or what we're calling today the workplace projection process. This process follows 3 steps, much like parents who are helicopter parents who obsess and focus on their children. This is when a member of senior leadership is focusing on a direct report really out of their own anxiety, out of the leader's own fear that something is going to go wrong with the work or with the project that that employee has been given responsibility to. And ironically, the employee becomes very aware of the hyper focus on them, and so they too, like a contagion, catch that anxiety. And then, of course, the senior leader observes that, and they wrongly interpret this employee anxiety as a confirmation of their fear. And so that's the great irony, is by misplacing fear onto others, our greatest fear can actually come true as leaders. And so the senior leader then treats the employee as if something really is wrong with them. And of course, the employee goes further down that path, and they begin to behave according to the leader's false expectations. And this is just a negative, downward spiraling process that repeats itself over and over again. And so over time, this can happen and get passed down through tenured employee through untenured employee. We see this in toxic workplace cultures. And this is what we call workplace multi-generational transmission process, or workplace MTP. And that is basically just the projection process being expounded. And so it's written across multiple generations, where leaders are replicating and passing down these patterns that they've learned within that workplace, or that they bring to the company from their own workplace history, or they can bring into the business based off of their own understanding of leadership from their own early family experiences, as our parents are the first leaders, good and bad, that we are exposed to. And so what this means is the leader in the workplace has their own expectations about workplace roles, and how to, quote, handle conflict, even though sometimes they simply just exacerbate and make the conflict worse. And so good leaders work to slow this projection process or this multi generational projection process by staying connected to their teams and by staying calm during periods of organizational stress. I see this a lot in really good organizations, especially like national or multinational organizations where there's high levels of stress and uncertainty, and you will see directors or C suite individuals get on a plane and go out into the field and visit their people, or in a factory or a plant. Instead of sitting on the top high rise floor, they will come down and they will walk the floor where the product is being made. High level leaders know that they need to be both present and a calm, non anxious presence in order to create a positive ripple effect throughout the business. You'll also see this occur at meetings, whether that's like a brand or marketing meeting, or a strategy meeting, or a marketplace meeting, or even like a team meeting before a shift. You'll see that the calmest person in that meeting actually has the most influence over the entire system. And so this is an incredible thing to keep in mind, because your front line, your low level managers, they can actually have some of the most significant impact on your business versus an absent senior leader in your organization. And so it's not necessarily the title of your role, but it's how you show up and how you positively take advantage of the role and the responsibilities that you've been given. And so when we as leaders raise and elevate our own level of differentiation, we can have a significant positive impact, not just across our teams, but across multiple levels of the workplace hierarchy. The seventh concept is what they call the sibling position in the workplace. Again, remember, we're talking about a workplace family. And so while in your own family of origin, you may have an oldest or a middle or a youngest child, we have something similar in the workplace where tenured people often act like oldest children, or even leadership can project onto them eldest children type expectations. And at the same time, we can have newer employees act like youngest children, and also have senior leadership put low level expectations on new employees, much like they would a youngest child. And so when this happens in organizations, you can see the most tenured employees carry within them institutional memory, and we can see them feeling perhaps maybe over responsible for company stability and taking it upon themselves to unnecessarily fix all problems around them. These types of employees can become rigid sometimes when they're unhealthy and territorial, maybe even anxious if they feel threatened by newer or younger employees. And as a result, they can begin to overfunction and move on to projects that are outside of their wheelhouse, outside of their designated scope. And that, of course, has a negative impact on your business and on your customers. At the same time, we can have new employees being have the benefits of being viewed as carefree or flexible or open-minded, someone who can learn the system of the company, but also they can sometimes come across as being less serious and inexperienced. And under pressure, they can underfunction because they know they might want to know more or should know more, but they're afraid to speak up. And so, as opposed to maximizing the ability of their roles, they simply underfunction, and the company loses the benefit of the value that they bring to the organization. And so, as a leader, how do we manage this, quote, sibling position dynamic? Well, we try to distribute responsibility thoughtfully and equally and according to the capabilities of each person, as opposed to how long they have or have not been in the organization. You can have a new person to the organization that actually brings a wealth of knowledge and experience that could have greater responsibility. At the same time, you can have a very tenured employee who's really chronically underperformed for years and not have a wealth of experience, and maybe that person needs a break. Maybe that person doesn't need to be delegated as much responsibility. Good leaders also minimize the opportunity for overfunctioning by being very clear with their tenured employees about their role boundaries and responsibilities, making sure that they don't get into roles and projects that they don't need to. Or if they're doing a good job of that, you look at ways to promote them. Maybe they've been undervalued for a long period of time, and overfunctioning is just a substitute for needing more responsibility. Good leaders also encourage new employees to take meaningful responsibility early on. They look at what they're bringing to the value of their role as they come into the company from another organization, and they give them good projects to where they can shine and they can show the value that they have to the organization. And of course, good leaders keep both of these groups connected by focusing on shared goals, goals that we have as individuals and goals that we have as a company, so that we can sharpen one another and all become better employees. The last and final concept is that of what they call societal emotional process in the workplace. And we talked about this at the opening of this presentation. In today's very highly connected business world, we see more and more polarization, and we see more and more reactivity in society. And unfortunately, this has an impact on our workplace. When anxiety in society rises, we see that the workplace begins to mirror very similar patterns. We see that people in the workplace expect quick fixes. We see quicker escalations and conflict. We see people overly eager to displace blame on other people, much like they do in society. And so, as a result, leaders that get caught up by this can often drift away from their thoughtful and principle based leadership style, and also lose focus on the mission and the customer. And this can, of course, negatively impact business. And so, how do high level leaders respond to societal emotional process? Well, again, this is a theme. They maintain a steady and non anxious presence by remaining focused on the mission, by drawing from their own personal values and principles. They reject and they resist, they're almost countercultural in avoiding and mirroring unnecessary senses of urgency or outrage or polarization. They anchor their decision making in their principles. They slow down the pace of decision making in order to reduce and eliminate impulsive, anxiety driven moves. And they are unafraid to speak up and define themselves about who they are as a leader clearly, yet are able to do so without attacking others or withdrawing from them. And so, as you can see, differentiated leadership or calm leadership is a skill set. It is not a destination, it is a journey, and it is a direction that we are all headed towards. And it requires continual self awareness, it requires continual work on yourself, it requires surrounding yourself with like minded, high level leaders so that you can not only advance the goals of your organization, but you can be a positive leader and influence on those that you lead and work with, on your customers, and you can come home and be actually a happier and healthier self. So, thank you for your time during this presentation. This is my giving back to the community, something that I do on a volunteer basis. If you'd like to discuss this in more detail or have some coaching done for your organization, I'm happy to do so in person or via Zoom. Thank you for your time.